grace motivates us to do good. When properly understood, grace is a motivation to do what is right, to do what is ethical. Jesus completely gave himself to set us free from our mistakes and wrongs. And considering how gracious he has been to you, how he's been to me, again, a proper response to his grace would be faith in him, diligence in following him, and wanting to do good. Consider the following. This is found in Titus 2, verses 11 and 12. It says, "The grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared to all men." And you notice what it says here, teaching us. And so here we're told explicitly that the grace of God teaches us that denying ungodliness and worldly lusts, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. And so when we look at this passage, there's a balance. There are things we are to avoid. Right? God's grace teaches us not only to avoid, but to deny certain beliefs, to deny certain practices. Here it says we ought to deny ungodliness and worldly lusts. But then there's the positive side. There's things we ought to believe and we ought to engage in. God's grace teaches us that we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world or in this present age. So again, grace ought to be a motivation to avoid, to deny things which are contrary to the will of God, things which are evil and wicked, but then also to be active in what is good, what is godly. Again, thinking about Christ and what he's done for us, he's paid the ultimate price to purchase us. Again, that's a grace that he has shown for us, that he has done for us. He went to the cross willingly to set us free from the guilt of sin. Acts 20:28, here at the end of the verse, speaks about how he purchased us with his own blood. He purchased the church with his own blood. Now, the church is the people, right? God never purchased a building with his own blood, right? He purchased a people, his people, with his own blood. We have been redeemed by the blood of our best friend, of our brother, if we accept him. He willingly paid that price to set us free. And not only has he shown us this grace, but he's extended this grace to everyone in the world. Now, in light of what Jesus has done, considering the complete self-sacrifice that he made, do you think it would be proper or right for a person to believe, I can keep on sinning because Jesus is so gracious, right? His grace, his love is just so immense. I can keep on sinning even though I know I shouldn't, but I can continue in sin. And just the more I sin, the more grace is going to overflow in my life. And that might sound kind of odd, but there are people who think that way. I've encountered people who've told me that kind of thing. Right? Well, I know my relationship isn't right, but hey, by the grace of God, I'm set free from my sins. And they'll continue in a sinful lifestyle because of God's grace. There's people who know they shouldn't go to the casino. They know, I'm married and I shouldn't be spending time with this person alone, but, I know the Bible condemns drinking and other things. I know there's certain things I shouldn't be doing, but by the grace of God, I can engage in these activities and it will be all right because, God is just so gracious. His grace is so radical. And people will flush their money down the toilet, sabotage their marriage, rob themselves of thinking clearly by using drugs and alcohol. And again, there's people who claim to be Christians, and if you ask them, why are you engaging in these kinds of activities? God's grace. God's grace is so radical and it's so profound. But does that sound like an appropriate response to God's grace? And this has been an issue among people who are claiming to be Christians for a very long time. Paul addressed this kind of thinking. And consider his words recorded for us in the beginning of Romans 6. What shall we say then? Shall we continue And I think continue is an important word here, right? We all make mistakes, obviously. We all need salvation. I don't believe Paul or anyone is saying we have to be sinlessly perfect in every single thing we do. But should we continue in sin that grace may abound? And Paul often asks these rhetorical questions, and here we find the answer. He says, certainly not. Right? Certainly not. How shall we who died to sin live any longer in it? So again, I'm not saying we have to be sinlessly perfect in every aspect of our life until we die. Again, I just think you're setting yourself up for failure if you think that way. I'm just trying to point out the fact here that grace is not a reason to sin. And there's some people who view it that way. That grace is God's permission for us to continue in sin when we know we're doing something wrong. And again, the Bible says, certainly not. We should not view grace that way. Just the more we sin, the more we do that which is wrong and contrary to God's will, the more grace is just going to overflow in our lives and everything's just going to be wonderful. Again, that's just a wrong way of viewing the grace of God. Again, God's grace teaches us to deny ungodliness and worldly lusts. It ought to be a motivation for us to do good and want to do good because of the sacrifice of Christ and all the blessings that God has given us, not only through His Son, but just basic blessings He's given us, living in this physical world and enjoying the simple pleasures in life.